Hello audience. Following the first part, which received warm support, we continue to make efforts to compile and edit the next parts. Ladies and gentlemen, to analyze a conflict, the first thing to do is to clearly understand the goals each side is aiming for. Through this video, we hope to bring you a multidimensional and deeper view of the nature and developments of the conflict. From there, it helps people form an accurate opinion about one of the most important events in the world today. If you haven't watched the first part, we recommend you watch it again to understand the cause and context before the war begins. Now, let's watch the second video in the series about breaking point in the Russia-Ukraine war, to explore part 2, adjustments in Russia's military strategy and the role of the President Zelensky in this war. This video will show us which party makes the decision. The Russia-Ukraine war needs to be ended through negotiation, or do you need to fight until winning and deviation? While watching the video, don't forget to like, subscribe to the channel and leave your comments so we can be motivated to serve you better. Sincerely thank. To evaluate a war, we first need to determine whether the goals each side pursues are consistent with the strategies they apply. A good goal may not be achieved if the strategy followed is not appropriate. After determining the strategy, the next factor that needs to be considered is the ability to implement that strategy. This assessment will be based on three main factors: command structure, military potential, and soldiers' qualifications and morale. In addition, we also need to consider whether the ability to maintain resources for the war can last or not. To understand the context of the conflict, we need to evaluate both the economic potential and production capacity of the warring parties, and also consider the level of people's support for this war. In addition, considering the war-conducting apparatus of the parties involved, the ability to quickly detect and correct mistakes, as well as the ability to adapt to new situations, is a key factor. Finally, we will synthesize and analyze the results of all these factors on the battlefield. To make it easier to follow, we can divide this conflict into four main stages. The first phase started when the war broke out on February 24, 2022 and lasted until April 2022. When Russia realized it could not reach a peace agreement with Ukraine and changed its strategic strategy. His painting. The second phase from April to July 2022, in which Russia withdrew from its positions in Kiev and redirected its forces to areas such as Donbass, ended with the defeat of the eastern military forces of Ukraine and occupied two important cities, Lysychansk and Severodonetsk. The third phase takes place from July to September 2022, which is the period of negotiations mediated by Turkey and Ukraine's successful counterattack in South Kharkiv. Phase 4, the final phase, starts from October 2022 until now, when Russia changes the nature of the war and prepares for a full-scale attack. The goal of the war for Ukraine is very clear, because they are the attacked side. They want to end the war, protect their territorial integrity with pre-2014 borders and ensure security for the future from threats from Russia, through joining NATO and the European Union, EU. In April 2022, after negotiations in Istanbul between Ukraine and Russia, the Turkish foreign minister, representing a NATO member state, expressed surprise that the war did not end as expected. Subsequent meetings between foreign ministers of NATO countries showed that some countries in this alliance wanted the war to prolong, to weaken Russia. In essence, they care little about Ukraine's current situation and do not wish peace for Ukraine. Just a few days later, the US announced through the Pentagon that it wanted Russia to be weakened to prevent any future conflict. At the same time, British Prime Minister Boris Johnson flew to Kiev, encouraged Ukraine to reject peace negotiations and secured significant economic and military aid from Britain. Meanwhile, President of the European Union Council Ursula Gertrude von der Leyen has stated that Russia will suffer an economic, financial and technological collapse, and Ukraine will move closer to a future with Europe. NATO's goal is not to restore peace in Ukraine but to weaken Russia through war. As for Russia, their goals in this war are the most difficult to understand. President Putin stated that the purpose is to denazize and demilitarize the Ukrainian government, but in reality no one really understands what these two goals mean. This gives Russia an advantage. It can interpret its goals in any way that suits the war situation. If the war goes well and a Ukrainian government in exile is established, Russia can declare it has completed denazification and the new government will automatically demilitarize. If the rapid overthrow campaign fails and becomes protracted, Russia could change its interpretation of its goals to geographical or military factors. For example, if they can eliminate or significantly defeat Ukraine's military forces, Russia could seek to end the war with a peace agreement favorable to them. For example, in the 2008 war with Georgia, after only 5 days of fighting, Russia destroyed 22% of Georgia's military, including elite forces trained by NATO. Russia could also interpret the concept of demilitarization as the seizure of all major Ukrainian military or defense industrial facilities, to ensure that the Ukrainian army cannot be rearmed. This also means that most of Ukraine's territory will fall into Russian hands, and they can explain that this is an act of militarization through the establishment of a buffer zone separated from Russia, corresponding to the long range of Ukrainian weapons. Foreign Minister Lavrov once said, "If the West provides Ukraine with missiles with a range of 100 kilometers, the Russian army will ensure that there are no weapons within 100 kilometers of the Russian border." This can be understood as the establishment of buffer zones from separatist republics on Ukrainian territory, similar to actions from 2014. Russia's initial goals were stated vaguely and no one understood clearly, thereby creating a large space for them to carry out later forward and backward activities, leading to unpredictability in their campaigns. Russian military strategy. We will analyze each side's strategy and implementation in each stage of the war. The first phase begins on February 24, 2022, when Russian troops withdraw from strategic points such as Kyiv and Kharkov. Russia's initial strategy appeared to be aimed at establishing a pro-Russian government in exile or forcing Ukraine to accept terms favorable to Russia. To achieve this, Russia has adopted several strategies. First, Russia conducted surprise attacks, paralyzing Ukraine's leadership and military forces without time to react. Second, they conducted deep and rapid attacks on many fronts to disrupt Ukraine's defense system. Third, they close in on major cities to pressure Ukraine into negotiations or create the conditions for a coup. Fourth, they opened a negotiation channel through a third party, not NATO. In the early weeks of the war, this strategy was evident in Russia's long-range and precise missile attacks on key bases of Ukraine's air force, air defense, and navy. Ukraine's air force and air defense were significantly destroyed, along with Ukraine's small navy being wiped out in a short period of time. Russian Su-34 fighter jets flew low over eastern Ukrainian cities to bomb, adding to the pressure. The Russian army entered from 3 directions on a front nearly 3,000 kilometers long, making it impossible for the Ukrainian side to predict the main attack directions or Russia's intentions. During the first period of the war, we did not see the mobility of large Ukrainian military units, tanks, armored vehicles, which showed that the command system of the Ukrainian army was somewhat paralyzed and unable to organize effective defense on the entire front. However, Ukraine succeeded in surviving until Western countries decided to give stronger support. Just days after the start of the war, as Russian troops approached Kyiv, President Putin called on the Ukrainian military to overthrow President Zelensky, a move that appeared to be a signal to pro-Russian forces in the Ukrainian government and army rebelled. The person who could replace Zelensky in the event of a successful coup would be Viktor Medvedchuk, the leader of the pro-Russian opposition party, who was later captured and exchanged with many Ukrainian prisoners of war. However, Russia's plan did not work out as expected. No coup occurred, and after the initial shock, the Ukrainian army gradually recovered and fought back increasingly fiercely. President Putin's dismissal of two senior leaders of Russian military intelligence in charge of Ukraine 2 months later may be a sign of this failure. Russia also tried to open a negotiating channel through a third country that is not a member of NATO, and it chose Israel as the intermediary. Israel is a suitable intermediary for this task because the Israeli population and politicians have a grudge against Ukraine's ultranationalist forces due to their fascist links. Emotionally, Israel has a closer connection to Russia than Ukraine, especially in the historical context of World War II, when Jews were mainly harmed by German and fascist forces. Not the Russians. Few people know that the core of the Israeli army in the early days of the nation's founding were former Soviet soldiers, Jews who immigrated to Israel following the call of their homeland. Jews from the Soviet Union were the most well-trained in military and security matters. Because Soviet policy placed class above ethnicity, allowing highly educated people the opportunity to advance in the military and security forces. Until the 1960s, the Israeli army relied heavily on Soviet military orders and writings. For example, Alexander Brix's Vyacheslav Highway, a famous work about the Soviet Patriotic War, is required reading for Israeli cadets. Even today, we can still find video clips in which the Israeli Army Orchestra sings favorite Soviet songs in Hebrew during the Patriotic War. Currently, since Russia intervened in Syria in 2015, Russia and Israel have established a regular line of communication to avoid clashes between the two countries' armies, demonstrating their close relationship and complications between these two countries in the international arena. During the past 8 years, Russia has shown remarkable restraint in unintended clashes between the two armies in Syria. According to former Israeli Prime Minister Naftali Bennett, Russia has deployed the S-300 missile system in Syria, and if the button is pressed, Israeli pilots can be shot down. Therefore, Israel's role as a mediator in helping negotiations between Russia and Ukraine could benefit Israel. This shows that, similar to Turkey, Russia, when intervening in Syria, skillfully did not turn the two adjacent countries, Israel and Turkey, into sworn enemies. On the contrary, they could even cooperate with them in the Ukraine war, which is also a diplomatic victory for Russia that we will discuss in another part. Choosing Israel, through the recent revelation of former Israeli Prime Minister Naftali Bennett, shows that Russia is very close to achieving its goal of forcing Ukraine to sign a peace agreement beneficial to itself. Putin's promise not to kill President Zelensky made him believe and return to the presidential palace from his hiding place. President Zelensky publicly live-streamed his presence there, and Ukraine and Russia entered into negotiations with a peace agreement in its 17th iteration. Both sides made significant concessions in April 2022, and the signing was only stopped when the US intervened to stop it. Naftali Bennett's revelation shows that, contrary to what most people think, the first phase of the war with the quick strike strategy was actually a complete failure for Putin. In fact, he almost succeeded in achieving his goal if it were not for the US intervention in blocking the signing of the agreement. The misconception that most of us have about the early stages can be reconsidered here. This shows that the Russian army's rapid advance deep into Ukrainian territory is not the result of subjectivity, arrogance, or contempt for the enemy. Reality shows that they have calculated quite accurately what happens in reality. We remember that during the first week of the war, the US and NATO countries secretly told President Zelensky that they would open their doors if he chose to go into exile. At that time of crisis, Russia seemed unable to achieve its goals as the West decided to support Ukraine more strongly. In our opinion, the turning point that Ukraine has achieved is thanks to the wise decisions of President Zelensky. Ukraine's strategy and implementation, along with support from the West in the early stages of the conflict, showed that survival was their top priority. Ukraine has implemented its strategy excellently, overcoming all seemingly impossible difficulties and challenges. In the first days of the conflict, when Russia tried to apply rapid attack tactics, President Zelensky's role became extremely important. He demonstrated sharp strategic vision in assessing and responding to the situation. In the next section, we will go into more detail about his role and decisions. After the initial dizziness and temporary paralysis of the first week of the war, due to Israel's offer to mediate negotiations, along with Naftali Bennett's assurance that Putin will not kill him, Zelensky returned to his role and began the live stream series. It must be recognized that President Zelensky has implemented an extremely skillful negotiation strategy, facing Ukraine's precarious situation while the Ukrainian army has still not recovered from the initial shock. This negotiating tactic, with both the West and Russia, shows that Zelensky is an excellent politician and actor, with a stage much larger and more complex than that of a true actor. However, staying in power for a long time seems to make tough politicians like Putin or Biden become conservative, apply traditional methods of behavior, and are often surprised by politicians. Politics with a new approach. We often see traditional figures such as Putin, Obama, Biden, and Medvedev always appearing at official ceremonies, wearing sophisticated suits and always maintaining a strong, cheerful attitude. Their words are often measured, elaborate, and carry profound meanings. In most cases, traditional politicians prevail over non-traditional opponents, unless these people have a deeper understanding of public sentiment through their behavior and their unique words. A prominent example is Donald Trump, Boris Johnson, and Zelensky. The man who caused Hillary Clinton to fail. Donald Trump, with a wealth of experience in showbiz, clearly understands what the public wants to hear and thus defeated Hillary Clinton. Similarly, with his journalistic experience, messy hair, and straightforward speaking style, Boris Johnson surpassed traditional opponents to become British Prime Minister. Zelensky's case is even more surprising. Without any political experience, he went straight from the stage into the presidential race with a party founded by the film production crew. The movie made its name. Ukrainians saw in Zelensky a completely contrasting image to President Poroshenko, a billionaire, while Zelensky was an actor who sold artistic labor to make a living. While Poroshenko has a huge team, Zelensky only has a few friends working alongside him. Without going into detail about the real people behind Zelensky, we won't discuss it here. Poroshenko is proud of his achievements in cutting ties with Russia and suppressing two separatist republics, while Zelensky talks about peace and seeks to live peacefully with neighboring Russia. During the televised debates, Zelensky took actions that completely surprised Poroshenko and made him passive, losing points before the people. A typical example is when Zelensky knelt down to commemorate those who died during the Maidan protests, making Poroshenko confused and not knowing what to do and finally had to reluctantly follow. It was Zelensky's breakthroughs that surprised both Putin and Western leaders. Immediately after being assured that Russia would not kill him, Zelensky returned to the country, took office as president and began a series of live streams. If Peter Arnest has become a legend among war correspondents, with CNN making his mark when he was the only person to live broadcast the scene of U.S. planes bombing Baghdad, then Zelensky has also created a miracle. No less. For the first time in history, thanks to the development of the internet, anyone in the world can watch a live stream from the presidential palace of a country under attack. And what's special is that it is the president of that country who does this. In one night, President Zelensky suddenly became the biggest star in the media sky, unmatched by anyone. Thanks to this live broadcasting ability, his message reached people not only in Ukraine and Russia but also around the world. This directly affected the decisions of both Western and Russian leaders in this war. During the first week of the conflict, information on the front remained obscure and almost no one knew where Zelensky was. During this period, the United States and Western countries expressed their willingness to accept his government in exile to continue the resistance. However, after a week of silence, and thanks to promises from Putin in the first live stream, Zelensky revealed his location and directly reported the bombardments from Russian troops in Kiev. He also affirmed that he was not afraid of anyone in the next live broadcast. In it, he spoke frankly about Ukraine's precarious situation and confessed that he had contacted Western leaders but received no response. With an undisguised look of fatigue and disappointment, he expressed that Western leaders promised to protect his life if he chose to go into exile. But he decided not to leave, but instead took up arms. Weapons to fight enemies. His statements may have surprised both Putin and Western leaders. No head of state has ever behaved like him. Zelensky's fierce words and attitude in the early days, along with his quick dispatch of a team to negotiate peace with Russia, caused each side in the conflict to rethink and take actions that would profoundly influence the course of the war later. As for Russia, it seems that Putin believes that he will reach a favorable peace agreement with Zelensky and that the war will end quickly. When the conflict began, Russian diplomatic agencies discreetly informed friendly countries that this particular military operation would end in about 15 to 20 days. This information was accidentally leaked and Western media quickly created a myth that Russia was confident to the point of arrogance, believing that it could occupy all of Ukraine in that short period of time. However, Putin did not just rely on what Zelensky announced on the live stream, but his intelligence system also provided important information that Zelensky really wanted to negotiate. Maybe Putin understood that Zelensky's statements about the leaders of Western countries avoiding his calls were a clever move, to mentally prepare the Ukrainian people to accept a peace agreement. Only benefits Russia. This may have prompted Putin to consider slowing down Russia's military progress in that area, to allow Zelensky to prepare domestic public opinion to support the smooth conclusion of a peace agreement. Then, however, from the West, Zelensky's actions were like a thunderbolt in a clear sky. For many years, in parallel with the public training and re-equipment of the Ukrainian army, the Western media system has made its public believe that the West is always ready to support Ukraine at any time. But President Zelensky's straightforward statements have turned him into a hero, while making Western leaders weak in the eyes of the people. This weakness becomes even more striking when compared to Putin's tough speech about the special military operation. In the eyes of the Western public, Putin is a dictator from the East, determined to destroy a small Ukraine with a rustic and brave president, but tired of being abandoned by his allies. Fall when difficulties come. Contrary to the promise of support, as soon as Russia launched the attack, their first action was to suggest exile, which made many Americans think of the collapse of the pro-American government in Afghanistan in just 3 weeks. And images of pro-American Afghans clinging to the undercarriage of planes evacuating Kabul in August 2021, just 4 months before Russia attacked Ukraine. This is also reminiscent of America's withdrawal from Vietnam in 1975, when the Republic of Vietnam collapsed after 55 days of fighting, and the scene of refugees crammed onto planes leaving Saigon returned. Became a symbol of a haunting failure. This obsession with failure was so strong that during the First Gulf War, even after destroying Iraq's largest military force, President Bush Sr. chose to stop the war to avoid being bogged down. And when he declared victory in 1991, he said, "Thank God we have eliminated the Vietnam syndrome once and for all." In August 2021, The fall of Kabul reminded many people of Saigon in 1975, to the point that both houses of the U.S. Congress were forced to hold a hearing for President Biden's administration to explain why the Taliban can win spectacularly. In that context, CNBC recorded a clip of a group of Ukrainian SBU employees burning documents in the backyard of their headquarters, making people think that they were preparing to withdraw from the area. However, recent revelations show that on February 25, 2022, one day after Russia opened the war, President Zelensky ordered the destruction of all documents related to biological laboratories, and the clip that CNBC recorded was the scene of SBU employees destroying those documents. As for Russia, they have asked the United Nations to investigate the activities of U.S. biological laboratories in Ukraine and announced that they are keeping 10,000 documents and evidence confiscated from the laboratories. This experiment. The investigation was not conducted because the U.S. used its veto power to prevent it. These diplomatic tricks of President Zelensky have forced the West to publicly and strongly support him, in both words and actions. This leads to the question of whether President Zelensky is the one pushing the West into a confrontation with Russia, or perhaps it is Zelensky who wants peace. However, Ukraine's political situation made it impossible for Zelensky to implement the Minsk agreement, and when war broke out, he needed Western support to have strength in negotiations with Russia. As things continued to develop, it got out of his control and the war continued. It is worth noting that Zelensky himself, from his background to his previous life, does not resemble the image of a neo-Nazi leader. He was of Jewish origin and his grandfather was an officer of the Soviet Red Army who was awarded many medals during the Patriotic War from 1941 to 1945 against Nazi Germany. He speaks Russian as his mother tongue and his artistic career is closely linked to both Ukraine and Russia, where he often performs, and even Putin has seen him perform. After the huge success of the television series, Servant of the People, in which he played a popular president who brought justice to the country, he ran for president against Poroshenko. As mentioned, Zelensky is diametrically opposed to Poroshenko in every aspect, from personal to political views. The most important difference is that he aimed for peace through negotiations with Russia. He has said many times that it is impossible to deny the fact, Russia has been, is and will always be next to Ukraine. So it is necessary to find common ground with them. After becoming president, perhaps Zelensky realized that things were not as simple as he thought. Domestic political forces all have the shadow of foreign powers behind them. These forces not only have money but also have their own armies in many forms, such as far-right nationalist paramilitary forces. These forces are better equipped than regular army units and are not under the control of the Ukrainian army. These private armies are willing to use force against politicians and state institutions, similar to what happened during the Maidan Revolution, which created the present-day Ukrainian state. Furthermore, it was only when he took office that Zelensky discovered that the NATOization and anti-Russian process that Poroshenko had carried out for the previous 8 years with the support of the West had become the process cannot be reversed by normal political processes. Perhaps he realized that any move to negotiate with Russia or implement the Minsk agreement would be interpreted by other powers as a new Valentinovich and that he could be overthrown as this person. When he realized this, he was forced to continue following the path that NATO and Poroshenko had previously created. However, there are signs that President Zelensky wants to save peace until the last minute. In December and January 2022, Russia sent a draft of an agreement regarding Ukraine to NATO and the US, and proposed negotiations. This shows that Russia is clearly aware that it is the US and NATO who decide on the implementation or creation of a peace mechanism for Ukraine, not Zelensky. The Russians were in a hurry because the Minsk agreement would expire on February 21, 2012, and after the US and NATO ignored Russia's requests, war broke out just 3 days after the agreement. Minsk expires. The noteworthy point is that a week before the war broke out, the Americans publicly announced in the press that Russia might use war to resolve the Ukraine problem. Immediately, Russia denied and declared that their army's exercise near the Ukrainian border was just a normal exercise. President Zelensky also spoke up, affirming that he was in Kyiv and knew the situation well, denying information about an impending war as Washington said. After the war broke out, Washington often used this event to imply that it had tried to save the peace by releasing that information, hoping that Russia would think again and Zelensky prepare. But neither Putin nor Zelensky did not listen to them, saying that President Zelensky is not intelligent because he does not believe the U.S. announcement about war is a wrong view. As mentioned, his becoming president of Ukraine proves that he is not only intelligent but also knows how to be flexible when necessary. I believe the Americans provided Zelensky with clear satellite images showing Russian units assembling in battle formation right on the border. He also understood that the model from exercises to attacks had been used by the Soviet Union in Hungary in 1956, Czechoslovakia in 1968 and Poland in 1980. So why did he publicly declare that there would be no war? Painting. Zelensky later explained that he had to make such a statement to avoid possible panic breaking out in Ukrainian cities. Perhaps yes. He was forced to say so to save face for the West, especially at a time when the U.S. was considering a $45 billion aid package. The real reason for countering Washington that there was no war was that he wanted to send a signal to Russia that he wanted peace. However, the Russians at that time truly believed that Zelensky's own desire for peace would not be enough, and that anti-Russian political forces in Ukraine needed to receive a strong blow before allowing Zelensky to sign the agreement. Favorable peace. Therefore, war still broke out. During the first week of the war, both the West and Russia assumed that the Ukrainian army would disintegrate and Zelensky would flee or sign a peace agreement with Russia. With the same judgment, both sides act in the most beneficial way for themselves. The Russians slowed down their offensive and began peace negotiations with Zelensky. If he had signed a peace agreement with Russia at that time, it would have been a perfect victory for Russia, demonstrating both its military power and the state's will to use war to achieve its goals. Lowest human cost. As for the West, if the Ukrainian army collapses, it will be more beneficial for Zelensky to join the government in exile. They will use this government in exile as a bargaining chip with Russia. Modern history has seen many similar examples, such as in 1939, after Poland was defeated by Germany and the Soviet Union, Britain hosted part of the Polish army in exile throughout the war. Until 1945. The British considered this to be the only legitimate representative of the Polish people. When the Soviet Union moved in to liberate Poland from Nazi Germany and set up a pro-government government, the West did not recognize the government. However, in 1945, Britain and the United States reached an agreement with the Soviet Union regarding the division of Europe after the war. According to this agreement, the Soviet Union would abandon the Greek Communist Party and the resistance movement in that country in exchange for Britain and the United States dissolving the Polish government in exile and accepting Poland under Soviet influence. Soviet and handed over all Russian exiles who fought for Nazi Germany and surrendered to the Allies. Immediately after the agreement was reached, the Polish government in exile was disbanded despite the fact that the Polish army in exile fought and bled on all Allied fronts in the West from 1940 to 1945. This may be the model the U.S. is aiming for when it publicly declares that it will open its doors if Zelensky goes into exile. However, both Russia and the United States were wrong in their assessment of Zelensky. The Ukrainian army and people stood strong against Russia. Meanwhile, President Zelensky has refused to go into exile. Even at the front, ordinary Ukrainian soldiers and low-ranking officers. Despite Russia's absolute superiority in firepower, air power and armor, continue to attack Russian troops at every opportunity. We have seen many videos of small, single Ukrainian combat groups using anti-tank guns and anti-tank missiles to intercept a large convoy of Russian tanks and armored vehicles. As a result, after shooting down one or two of the leading aircraft, those combat groups were quickly destroyed by Russian troops. However, Ukrainian soldiers continued to carry out their duties. Russia's military failures in the early stages of the war were not due to confrontation with the main Ukrainian army, but rather to the failure to protect the logistical transport routes for armored forces from ambushes by individual groups of the Ukrainian army. When the war broke out, people's reaction to the Russian army reflected the previous divisions in Ukrainian society. In the eastern regions, many people welcomed the Russian army or were indifferent when the Russian army entered, while in the west and south, many Ukrainians blocked the streets to protest the Russian army. Although this could not stop the advance of the armies, the people's reaction was transmitted around the world, forcing the Russian leadership to be more careful in using firepower. This left Russia's armies tied up and led to heavy losses. A typical example is the destruction of a Russian FSB Special Forces platoon in the town of Chernihiv near Kiev. The reason was because this unit complied with the regulation, only open fire when attacked. So this unit was ambushed and completely destroyed by the Ukrainian Special Forces team along with armored vehicles at a distance of 20 to 30 meters. Most Russian soldiers were shot down while sitting in their vehicles, without having time to shoot back. The fact that the Russian army advanced quickly and did not open fire on civilians led to a funny scene that had never happened in war. The Russian army temporarily left behind broken armored tanks on the way to advance, to let the troops came to take over and repair. The Ukrainian farmers believed that they would not be shot, so they calmly used tractors to drag these broken tanks to their homes. The image was broadcast around the world, leading to contempt for the Russian army, saying that the Russian army is a weak and stupid army. The Western press did not report the professionalism and courage of the Russian troops at the beginning of the war. For example, the capture of Antonov Airport by 200 Russian Special Forces soldiers and the successful defense of this position until reinforcements arrived, despite the counterattack of Ukrainian troops with numbers 10 to 20 times greater. When the war entered Phase 2 after General Alexander Dvornikov, nicknamed the Syrian Butcher by the West, took over command of Russian troops in Ukraine in April 2022 and Russia moved to "If we fight big in Donbass, no one will believe that the Russian army is stupid anymore." And if there were Russian tanks and armored vehicles abandoned in the middle of the field because of engine failure, no Ukrainian farmer would be foolish enough to repeat the scene of dragging a tank to his house again. In the first weeks of the war, when the West still did not believe that Ukraine could stand and did not provide strong arms and financial support for Ukraine, Zelensky began negotiations with Putin through the mediator Israel. At this time, Zelensky clearly understood that the harshness of the conditions proposed by Russia would depend on Western support and Ukraine's ability to resist. He was also aware that ultranationalist forces could overthrow or even kill him and his family. For those reasons, Zelensky carried out 4 actions simultaneously. First, he publicly announced to the world that he refused the offer of exile that Washington had made. Second, he announced that he would fight against the Russian invasion and called on the people to fight together. Third, secretly, he took his parents to Israel. Fourth, he publicly accepted negotiations with Russia. The fact that Zelensky brought his parents to Israel is noteworthy. He knows that he and his wife cannot leave Ukraine, but his parents may be controlled by all sides, especially extremist nationalist forces. This is the reason he decided to take his parents abroad. He also understood very clearly that the United States and NATO countries were the reason why the Minsk Agreement could not be implemented and had in fact blocked the chances of peace by rejecting a security mechanism related to Ukraine because Russia proposed when the Minsk Agreement expired. That's why he sent his parents to Israel, not to the US or other NATO countries. Israel does not like Ukrainian ultranationalist forces because of their links to Nazi Germany and the massacre of Jews during World War II. This made it impossible for Ukrainian ultranationalist forces to reach out to Israel to control his parents. His acceptance of Israel as a mediator also led the Russian side to promise Bennett that they would not try to kill him. Therefore, Mr. Zelensky's move to bring his parents to Israel was not just a simple move. First, he ruled out the possibility that ultranationalist forces could arrest his parents. Second, he ensures that the US and NATO cannot control them either. Third, he showed Putin that he trusted Putin's promises and placed his parents' safety in the hands of the intermediary that both he and Putin had chosen. Zelensky's cleverness was shown not only in combat but also through public negotiations, showing that Ukraine and Russia were about to reach a peace agreement, which caused the West to change its attitude. However, there were other factors that caused the West to not only change its attitude but also set a goal completely opposite to its original goal in the early days of the war. That is using Zelensky's government in exile to bargain with Russia. These factors include: first, they were aware of Russian losses due to supply convoys being intercepted and vanguard units being ambushed and destroyed. They do not realize that these damages are mainly due to the tactics used by Putin, which are intended to enable President Zelensky to convince the opposition of the need for a peace agreement with Russia, but do not causing great damage, making it difficult to mend relations with Russia later. Second, the West is aware that Russia's caution in the early stages is due to Russia's fear of Western economic sanctions like in 2014. The West also does not believe that when applying these measures, what economic turmoil will they suffer from economic sanctions, and Russia will not be affected as severely as they expected. Third, the West believes that Mr. Putin will not have the courage to go to the end of the war. From the above observations, instead of advising President Zelensky to go into exile, the West has declared that it will stand side by side with Ukraine and provide everything necessary to defeat Russia. Although Zelensky forced the West to support him, just like last month, when he was helpless when the West left Ukraine to face the war with Russia by not responding to its security proposals. Russia, when the Minsk Agreement expired, this time too, things slipped out of his control. When the West believed that he would not flee, the Ukrainian people and army were forced to fight Russia, but they did not have to fight to reach a peace agreement, but fought to weaken Russia. Zelensky needs Western support to have strength in peace negotiations with Russia. However, in return, he received that support not to achieve peace but to exhaust Russia. This is exactly what Turkish Foreign Minister Cavusoglu commented on. After the meeting of the foreign ministers of NATO countries, there was an impression that among NATO countries there were some countries that wanted the war to continue to prolong the war and weaken Russia. They don't care much about Ukraine's situation. For his part, Zelensky cannot go against the West because once the West has declared its full support for him, the extent of its actual support will be discussed later. The country will not forgive you if you continue to negotiate. As the term of the Minsk agreements comes to an end, Russia realizes that Ukraine cannot decide on a new security arrangement mechanism. Therefore, Russia asked the US and NATO to participate in negotiations. However, the US and NATO's refusal to negotiate, along with the previous investment and equipment of the Ukrainian army, led to a preemptive Russian attack on Ukraine in the first days of the war. Both Russia and the West were wrong to believe that Ukraine would easily surrender. But thanks to the ingenuity of President Zelensky, the heroism of the Ukrainian team after the initial shock, and the patriotic spirit of the Ukrainian people, Both Russia and the West have realized that Ukraine will not collapse quickly. This led to major concessions from Russia to sign a peace agreement. On the contrary, the West believes that Russia will give up early because of weakness and sets a completely opposite goal than the original, asking Ukraine to wage war to weaken Russia. Zelensky, who had ridden on the tiger's back, could not get off and was drawn into the war. This is a summary of part 2 in the series, Breaking Point in the Russia-Ukraine War. Don't forget to like, share and leave comments so we have the motivation to continue producing better quality videos to serve our audience. Stay tuned for the next parts.